Today we are continuing to analyze just what exactly went wrong for the Soviet bands in the West. Last time we talked about Grebenshchikov's failed American release Radio Silence, as well as Vabank's Finnish self-titled album. If you still haven't watched the previous video, go do it now to better understand what exactly is happening here. This is the cursed story of Soviet rock's time in the West, Part 2. So far, the mistakes we have noted include bringing unfinished or weak material, as well as inappropriate image and instrumental choices that don't fit a certain artist's style. Before we continue though, I think it's a good idea to also ask ourselves a question of what exactly can we count as success. For example, some artists are universally loved by the masses, they sell millions of records, but in the more progressive music circles, these artists might be disregarded as examples of poor taste or for being derivative. On the other hand, there are artists that aren't radio friendly but have gone to influence many key figures in the music world, or are loved by the more progressive music listeners and held in high regard as examples of good taste, so to say. These are both examples of success, even though the outcome is completely different. So how do we know which type of success and failure are we looking at? I think that the best way we can look at it is by checking the artist's intention. So far, the situation we looked at has been pretty easy to constitute as failure since Radio Silence was panned by both music journalists and it did poorly on the normie charts. The situation becomes trickier with more avant-garde sort of bands, where commercial success wasn't even an option. This means that there's more room for debate if these are failures or not, so keep that in mind. Anyways, let's begin. One of the most respected and popular live acts in the country was Zvuki Mu. Zvuki Mu were the proud poster boys of the Moscow alternative scene. Peter Mamanov's mix of theatrical and humorous live performances paired with eclectic music that combined elements of psychedelia, jazz funk, krautrock, blues, and everyone's good old trusted Soviet post-punk made Zvuki Mu look like the perfect band to send for export. And to an extent, the experts were right. During Brian Eno's visit to Moscow, it was Zvuki Mu and their second album Krim that caught the musicians' attention more than any other Soviet band. The plan was set. Zvuki Mu were going abroad and they have one of the most respected artists as their producer. The band's next album was going to be done with the help of Eno and released on his cult label Opel Records. One little common misconception is that Zvuki Mu were the first band that Eno ever released on his label. Technically, that's wrong. 1 year prior to Zvuki Mu's album, Opel Records would put a Soviet track titled For Her Atoms on the compilation Music for Films No. 3. The piece was a collaboration between Lydia Theremin, one of the most well-known promoters of the theremin instrument, and Misha Malin, a cult figure of the Leningrad underground world that worked with the likes of Knifer Frau Müller and Внезапный Стич.
С Брайаном Ино просто произошел интересный случай, потому что Брайан Ино мой любимый композитор, и я все время его слушал в свое время, некоторую часть своей жизни, и очень его любил, и постоянно думал о нем, но когда пришла перестройка, просто написал ему письмо, да и все. И послал ему подарки, и он мне ответил. А ему это очень понравилось, что в Советском Союзе кто-то вообще знает такого человека, как Брайан Ино. Потому что Брайан Ино считал, что в Советском Союзе просто все бегают в телогрейках там, и, в общем, занимаются непонятно чем.
If you want a video about any of these cult artists, drop a like in a comment below. Anyway, back to Zvuki Mu. The first factor in Zvuki Mu's favor was the music. Unlike Vabank or Grebenshchikov, the band didn't nervously scramble for new songs. Instead, the band, along with Brian Eno, picked out what they deemed to be their strongest material, with Zvuki Mu members leaning towards their Soviet hits of Простые вещи, while Eno preferred the much more experimental and original works on Krim. The result? Although, in my personal opinion, the selection lacks the dark, brooding side of Zvuki Mu's music, it is still quite solid and much better than everything we have seen so far.
Вся твоя самоотдача 0 минус 1 0 минус 1.
We avoided the first mistake of Soviet musicians. Now we're moving to the second step with the band's image. Although Artemy Troitsky claimed in his book Tosovka that Mamonov constantly sabotaged the recording process since he demanded that Brian Eno turn his art punk collective into a Brian Ferry style sophisti-pop band, just a little subtle trolling from Mamonov. In reality, the band was promoted as the go-to weird Soviet avant-teen band. The music could definitely appeal to the Western alternative crowd. Zvuki Mu's shows were unpredictable, original, and memorable, so the audience could also have fun seeing them live. Unlike Grebenshikov that was shilled everywhere without any thought, the people behind Zvuki Mu's PR had a cohesive direction. The possibility of Peter Mamonov sharing a stage with Bon Jovi is equal to zero, but they can easily play their music for fans of the Residents or the Cardiacs. Zvuki Mu would even get the chance to have their own Peel session. Although the reception to the band was mixed, with some reviewers being harsher than the others, it seemed like Zvuki Mu's story was going to be that of success. Things would take a difficult turn during the band's second tour across the states. At this point, Zvuki Mu started being advertised as the Soviet Talking Heads, which in reality was pretty misleading since the music and general vibe was very different. But hey, if the lead singer acts like a schizo on stage, it must be a Talking Heads clone. Anyway, Zvuki Mu continued playing shows, the band would give interviews to the biggest music magazines on the planet such as Rolling Stone, and everyone seemed quite satisfied with their time in the West. Well, everyone besides the main person. That was Peter Mamonov. Late 80s marked the beginning of Mamonov as a successful Russian actor. After debuting as the main villain in the cult Kazakh new wave film Igla, and also playing the main role in the award-winning drama Taxi Blues, theater, cinema, and performance art became way more intriguing to the great wild man from Moscow. Besides starting a successful acting career, Mamonov expressed his general disinterest in rock music.
Во-первых, мы сейчас делаем с Алексеем, с моим братом, какую-то новую, но я не знаю, что это будет, музыка это будет или это просто будет. Я считаю, что время песен кончилось вообще, и это будет не песни, а какие-то шумы, и под этот шум мы что-то будем на сцене делать. Мы хотим сделать какой-то необычный свет такой, и какое-то такое представление.
Soviet post-punk, Western art punk, this music stopped being radical and instead turned into a routine with Mamonov having to overplay what came to him naturally. As a result, Mamonov would basically denounce popular rockist art forms for a large portion of the 90s, instead expressing interest in noise, avant-folk, trip-hop, and spoken word genres.
Я уехал бы в Вайоминг, но это был бы не Мамонинг.
Zvuki Mu's inability to expand beyond the Zolo, minimal wave, and post-punk styles had made Mamonov try out his luck with the solo release Mamonov y Alexei. In my humble opinion, if not the best, it sure is one of the most impressive Mamonov works out there.
Все крыши упали, все заборы покосились, а листья опустились на меня. Все крыши... Я бы мог ходить по городу, но ходить мне лень. И я лежу на диване и думаю про деньги, которые дашь ты мне в долг. Которые дашь ты мне в долг. Я осеннюю пору люблю. Люблю посидеть на брегу широкой родимой реки, где плещутся судаки. И я не скрываю, и ты не скрываешь, и мы не скрываем.
Sadly for Mamonov, his new anti-rock and pro-experimental bard music weirdness wasn't something that the Western labels wanted to promote. On one hand, Mamonov made his most radical and original work yet, but on the other, a work that is actually 100% Russian culture is also 100% uninteresting to the Western labels. With Mamonov having absolutely no interest in staying in the West or continuing to work under the Zvuki Mu name, the original classic lineup of Zvuki Mu ceased to exist, and Mamonov would come back to Moscow with a happy little smirk on his face. He owned a brand, he owned the Western music establishment, he owned the record labels, and he owned his own band members too. Now the man can live in the woods and make his bedroom trip-hop album in peace.
О собственной музыке. Да, и вот наряду с этим я тоже вставил свои все компакты, их слушаю, оцениваю как бы со стороны. Вот. В золотых у меня стоят из старых Крым, вот нами сделанный такой, соведенный бешено, безумно, вот так, где ничего не ясно. Вот это. И вообще я убедился, ребята, кто вот записывает, два главных правила. Первый тейк самый лучший. Не обращая внимания ни на там, неважно. Вот он самый ништяк. Всегда. Ну так выходит. Вот. И второе, что забыл. Неважно, забыл. Что-то еще там было из этого же. В общем, вот свежесть. Ты понимаешь? Вот неожиданность. Да. Случайно выходит все великое. Все вот хорошее выходит случайно. Вот где была транснадежность. Работали, терли. Ну так себе. Единственное, пожалуй, исключение составляет вот Мамонов и Алексей. Второй альбом, где терли и вышло. Песен любимых как таковых нет. Есть, они все любимые. Потому что они все мои, я ни от чего не отказываюсь. Есть просто любимые исполнения, а есть отвратительные. Простые... Да. Вот простые вещи альбом отвратительный. Я сам себе не нравлюсь там безумно. Вот это Большой театр. Откуда, взялось? Сейчас очень просто я пою. Кричу. Вот «Жизнь амфибии». Хороший альбом. Очень я люблю.
What can we learn from Zvuki Mu's situation? The general personality of an artist could play a tremendous role in making or literally breaking a band. Mamonov's polarizing and at times bipolar behavior makes this one of the trickiest stories to cover. I have seen so much contradictory material about Zvuki Mu with me having absolutely no idea who to believe. For example, Artemy Troitsky says that Mamonov wanted to make the album sound more polished and clean. Mamonov, on the other hand, says that Eno wasn't capturing the raw energy of the band correctly, and he had to take matters into his own hands to keep the original charm of Zvuki Mu. Who is telling the truth? I don't know, but one thing is clear. Mamonov is a wild card that is hardly going to get along with anyone, no matter the status. If Grebenshchikov was too underground for the Western pop charts, Mamonov was too crazy for the Western indie circles. He had no breaks, and if not for Alexander Lipnitsky, the diplomatic bassist of the band who usually gave the interviews in Western magazines, Zvuki Mu's presence on the Western streets would have been even more polarizing and deranged.
Zvuki Mu распались крайне не вовремя, потому что, во-первых, у нас был еще контракт с Брайаном Ино, и мы должны были записать полноценный второй альбом, и, в общем-то, был материал для этого. Поэтому Мамонов очень опрометчиво поступил, распустив тот состав. потому что от него, в общем-то, Брайан Ино сразу отказался, посчитав, что он человек ненадежный, и поэтому не продолжил работу с группой Мамонов и Алексей, потому что подумав, что раз меня один раз подвели, то меня могут подвести еще раз. Вот. И я, во-первых, никогда не слышал про высказывание Петра Мамонова, что в 1989 году идея звуков Му себя исчерпала, никогда я не слышал. И она не исчерпала себя и в 90-м году, что как раз подтверждает тот факт, что он через несколько лет собрал новую группу. Я считаю, что здесь было налицо порождение типичной звездной болезни. Вот со всеми ее атрибутами, надо сказать, что под воздействием старшего брата и Леша Мамонов впал в эту болезнь в полный рост и вышел из нее только несколько лет назад.
Here's the real catch in all of this. Mamonov wasn't the only Soviet artist that came to break hell on the producers and band members. In fact, there's a decent chunk of Soviet artists that simply failed in the West due to inner conflict. A similar story happened to the Leningrad new wave band Avia. Avia's original mix of kitschy, art pop, and theatrical sots art aesthetics were received really well abroad. The band's album Avia was given good reviews, and the band's live shows was an adored spectacle which appealed to all the Western stereotypes about the commie bloc, with a good dose of humor sprinkled in to make it seem fun rather than tasteless or pretentious. Here is another great band with lots of potential, but guess what? Anton Adasinsky, the main man responsible for the awesome shows and choreography, decides that new wave is old news and forms his own acting crew called Dereva, which starts touring on its own. Avia fell in shambles, and the Western career came to an end. Post-edit MelodyBuffet here, I kind of made it sound like Anton Adasinsky leaving Avia made the band fall apart. That is not true. Avia would continue playing for another 2-3 years or so across Europe and Western countries, but my point is still basically correct because Avia would fade away in popularity due to the fact that all the musicians in Avia started working on various solo projects and other creative endeavors. So, for example, Rakhov would start working with Nom, and Gusev had his own ideas and projects. So basically, my point is still correct. Avia did fall apart because people started working on other music. It's just not only Adasinsky. I made it sound like Adasinsky was the main reason. That's not true. It's everyone involved. Okay, hopefully I don't get any comments about that. So everything's clear. Alright, back to the video. What lesson can be learned from the Zvuki Mu and Avia situation? Send a band abroad which isn't on the brink of total collapse due to inner conflict. Although Mamonov's tough character could be a source of critique, I just call that being based and fully support it. Next band on our list is Kino. Kino's time in the West is a little different from all the other bands. The first interesting Western-Soviet partnership happened at the Sundance Festival, where Victor Tsoi, Yuri Kasparyan, Joanna Stingray, and the director Rashid Nugmanov came to showcase the brand new film Igla. The movie was well received, but what intrigued the Americans even more was the character of Tsoi, who was asked to perform for the audience at the festival. Together with Kasparyan, the duo would play a small set of about 5 to 6 songs. After the concert, Nugmanov and Tsoi were approached by William Gibson, yes, the one who wrote Neuromancer. William and Nugmanov had an idea for a movie about a capitalist Leningrad that was surrounded by a civil war in the communist USSR. The movie was supposed to star Tsoi, and the soundtrack would be a collaboration between Kino and David Byrne. The plan was set, and a rough draft for the screenplay was written shortly after. Besides traveling to the States, Kino's music would end up in France. The band wasn't the first or last Soviet act to release music there. In fact, 3 cult Soviet post-punk bands would end up working with French producers that same year. Unlike the American labels, which tried to find the next Huey Lewis in the news, French labels went straight for the alternative appeal. The French interest in Soviet music started with the release of a compilation called Rockin' Soviet. The compilation was quite unique and eclectic for the times, featuring music from the Arkhangelsk solo metal band Oblochny Krai, Siberian blues rock icons Klinov Most, Moscow art punk band DK, and classic Soviet post-punk represented by Televizor, Center, and Kino. A lot of the Soviet-French collaborations and opportunities were thanks to a man by the name of Joël Bastener. Hopefully I pronounced that right, if not, my apologies. Joël was an important figure in the French music circles and also had connections with many important people in Russia. He was friends with the cult author Mamleev, he would have the chance of interacting with the great composer Alfred Schnitke, and with the perestroika craze, he decided to check the rock music in the Soviet Union. Unlike the others, Joël came in looking for something original and different, and he would soon find it. Since we started talking about rock music, I want to highlight the fact that the artist I was most interested in relied less on plagiarism at the time than the others. It's not a mere coincidence that I didn't become a producer for hard and heavy, the important movements such as post-new wave or social conscious bands like DDT. Besides Kino, I only produced unusual sounds and original behavior on stage, unknown to the European listener. DK, Auktyon, Zvuki Mu, Vopli Viroplasova, they were caricatures of barbarians who came from the steppes with their strange customs. I did this out of love for the outlandish and also to satisfy the public's demand for exotic things. These groups partially rewrote the basis of Anglo-Saxon music, but at the same time transformed them at the very end. At the time, the French public wanted rock to be French, freed from the English rules. So with this background in mind, Soviet rock started appearing in France. Following the Rock and Soviet compilation, 3 Russian bands would be given the chance to release an album in France. These bands were Center, Auktyon, and Kino. The first attempt at European stardom was done by Center with their album Made in Paris. The record failed to generate any buzz or commercial success, and Vasily Shumov's band would be quickly dropped. In hindsight, I can't fully understand why Center's album did so poorly, since it actually sounds quite nice in my opinion, but I would assume that the problem is due to Center's lack of hooks in music.
Дизайнер Алексеев Андрей Васильевич, министр Алексеев Георгий Игоревич, профессор Алексеев Аркадий Федорович, менеджер.
They have great instrumentation, but Shumov's deadpan delivery and lack of sing-along melodies might have had a negative impact. Okay, back to Kino. Victor Tsoi had previously expressed his dislike for the Rock and Soviet compilation, since he thought that his band would be given a whole side on the record, just like the Red Wave compilation. But instead, the album was dominated by DK. Besides wanting to have more of his band's music, Tsoi didn't like the aesthetics and album design of the compilation. Although Tsoi might have disliked the album, independent French radio stations started picking up and playing Kino songs on the radio thanks to this little record. This fact interested Joël, who got in contact with the band. The deal was very simple. Kino has all the freedom in choosing the tracklist for the album and recording it. The French producers have all the freedom in changing whatever they don't like at the studio. This partnership would result in the creation of the album Последний герой. The story of how this album was made is about as cursed as everything else in the East meets West timeline. I will not go into crazy details, but if you're interested, there's a great 3-part series by Machina Records that goes into all the details. Unlike the other Soviet bands, Kino did not mess with the format or try to reinvent themselves on the spot. Quite the contrary, the band chose the most well-known and anthemic songs in the catalog. This includes Перемен, Мама мы все тяжело больны, self-titled track Последний герой, Электричка, Группа Крови, and the iconic Спокойная ночь as the grand closer. Can't knock the band for the tracklist, well thought out and pop friendly. The new version of the songs were recorded at Valery Leontiev's studio after the first version of the album was rejected by the French producers for being too unprofessional and lo-fi. Go check out my Edward Artemiev video to find out who Valery Leontiev is, by the way. In a span of a week, the new version of the album was sent to France, and this time everything seemed fine. Back in France, the producers polished Kino's music to be on par with the popular European standards of the time. This includes making the album sound more compressed, louder, and those sort of things. The French producers wanted to make the album as radio-friendly as possible, and this meant that the time length of the songs were cut short. As a result, a lot of the original build-up of Kino's music suffered. This can be best seen in the album's version of Перемен, probably the most energetic and important Kino song of all time. What is the most iconic musical aspect of Перемен? I think it's clearly the outro of the song. Well, the French producers decided that all of this was too long, so the song simply fades out after the last chorus. But whatever, at least they left Spokojная ночь unedited. After months of work, Последний герой was finished and ready to be sent to the European radio and music stores, right? Well, remember our good friends from Moscow, Center, and their failed album Made in Paris? Following Center's disastrous album sales, Polydor, the label that was supposed to be responsible for the global distribution of Kino, decided that the Soviet experiment was done for and refused the band in distribution outside of France and any sort of promotion. As a result, Последний герой would be released only in France with zero radio or TV promotion, and the album quickly faded away in the huge French music stores. The only people that picked up the record were listeners of independent alternative radio, where the band's only single, Maman, that's the Mama мы все тяжело больны, got some airtime in 1990. With Tsoi's sci-fi acting career on his way and a failed album released in France, it's uncertain whether Kino would have managed to achieve something greater in the West, since very shortly after all this, Victor Tsoi tragically died in a car crash. What can we learn from Kino's story? It seemed like Kino had it all. A well-thought-out tracklist with memorable, full-fledged songs. They complied with all the demands of Western producers and avoided open conflict, unlike, say, Peter Mamonov, even if that meant ruining their biggest hit. They were accessible enough for the radio listeners. Why did it fail this time? Kino's story is about the importance of promotion and media. No matter how good your music is, if the label has no faith in you, the possibility of breaking out is very low. Also, it's a good idea to not die in the middle of this, but that's a factor you can't really control. Maybe if the record executives started out with Kino instead of Center, the situation would have been different. Who knows? The harsh facts are these though. Soviet Union's biggest rock band got less promotion than a hipster new wave band from a Moscow rock laboratory. What you are hearing right now is a piece of lost media. In 1988, the cult Soviet pop rock band Secret recorded an English version of their soon-to-be smash hit album Leningradskaya Vremya, or Leningrad Time in English. Secret was one of the few popular bands that had Western appeal, as their music consisted of catchy 80s power pop on par with something like Rick Springfield. The album was recorded and sent to the Melodia studios. Everything was done with the best possible quality in the USSR. Secret was ready to take on Europe with a melodic and catchy album, but then something went wrong. That something was the state label Melodia, which considered the Russian version of the album to be superior, and put the English version of the album somewhere on the shelf, untouched to this very day. It's probably collecting dust somewhere in St. Petersburg or Moscow as we speak. Even when a band delivers an interesting product with potential Western appeal, the Soviet state scrapped it without a care. The Soviets weren't the only ones who left interesting projects on the shelf. In comes the great Peter Gabriel. A man who wrote some of the greatest albums of all time, countless iconic songs. I don't think Peter Gabriel needs an introduction. One of the most interesting 80s prog bands from the USSR was Nuance. They weren't super well known, but they had played a set at the Moscow Peace Festival, and according to an old legend, were singled out by none other than Ozzy Osbourne as the best Soviet band he heard at the festival. Nuance started gaining some momentum, and soon the king of 80s art pop, Peter Gabriel, says that he is interested in working with the band. the second British-Soviet collaboration at the same time as Brian Eno was working with Zvuki Mu, which I remind you was probably the most successful Soviet Western project at the time. Nuance totally fits the Gabriel vibe, kind of proggy, kind of new wavy, musicianship on par with the Western colleagues. As the great Fred Durst once put it, along with Peter Gabriel came talks about getting high-ranking Western sound engineers that worked for Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. Nuance were more than happy to be given this opportunity, and so they started working on a new Peter Gabriel co-signed album, writing songs for the big global breakout. And then Peter Gabriel simply dipped out of the project, just like that, calmly, politely, like a true English gentleman. Nuance had already finished half of the songs, and then they find out how the album wouldn't be made or released. The end result was an unfinished album released on the Russian SNC label, which didn't do much and had zero promotion. Whether it's Melodia or hip Western artists, a good amount of Soviet albums simply didn't get released because one side quit midway during the process, or the label deemed the music unworthy of releasing. So the lesson we can learn here, make sure that nobody quits and leaves the band with nothing. I guess this is what contracts of various sorts are made for. Now, we have spent a great deal talking about failures, but let's quickly go over some other smaller, lesser known examples of Soviet Western projects that didn't take off. I'm gonna try and cover these as quickly as possible because we don't have all day. Symbol of perestroika pop and what I like to call alternative estrada. Despite having a great voice and unique stage presence, Aguzarova didn't know how to speak English, and her Russian songs were rejected from American radio as a result. Kind of hard to make it big in the States when there's a well-known band on the American market with the exact same name as yours. This one wasn't actually a failure. In fact, it was a success, but Sergei Kuryokin got bored of the Western crowd and spent the next decade promoting Japanese music.
You are dying, nothing left for you. Nothing wicked, whispering my sleep. Fighting, process, seeking sacred truth. Blinded by your family.
Gonna guess that people living in West Germany were concerned with other things in the late 80s than some Soviet heavy metal bands. Probably the saddest case on the list, Chestikov's mother became very ill and Fyodor had to throw his plans away and take care of her. Those that are familiar with Nola's story should know how badly everything turned out, but for those that are unaware, Chestikov basically got some sort of schizophrenia, attacked his girlfriend, and then got locked up in a mental asylum. Made a pretty good album, but the listening party in France was ruined by French nationalists that came with posters telling Ruskies to go home.
Ну, уже к концу 80-х мы с вами собрались на зарубежные гастроли.
Ну да, было такое дело.
И помню даже какую-то антисоветскую демонстрацию, которая совпала с представлением вашего альбома «Как я стал предателем». Ты помнишь, что когда французы сразу эти две пластинки показали публике на большом приеме, в том числе и кино, группа людей, которые еще не верили в перестройку, я имею в виду французов, они же там развернули какие-то плакаты.
Я помню, что
скандал там был, полиция была приглашена.
Да, я просто не помню самого скандала. Я помню, что действительно мы вышли и видели, как пластинки наши бьют, значит, эти какие-то панки там местные. Мы так думаем, ну ладно, что.
This one isn't actually a failure. The band managed to get its hit single in Finland, but on a global scale, it didn't do much. Okay, so we went through all the examples that I want to talk about, and now I'm gonna give my quick rundown on the things that a Soviet band would probably need when working abroad. First of all, a very basic thing, but I think it's very important: good material. You need to bring music that is interesting and it stands out. One of the biggest problems that most of these bands have is just a lack of strong material, especially in the first episode when we looked at Vabank and Boris Grebenshchikov. But this can apply to many bands. Especially if you want to do more pop-friendly music, you need to bring songs that have strong, catchy hooks and huge replay value. Something you can hear on the radio and go, wow, that is interesting. I want to hear more of that. A lot of these bands didn't do that. They brought in quite basic stuff or material that's kind of, half cooked. We need to have our strongest material on the table. If I had to pick the band that did it best, it would probably be Kino. Even though I'm personally not a huge fan of the band, I think that they understood this concept best. They really put in all their strongest, most pop-friendly material on an album and sent it abroad. Alright, now the second point. This one can be a bit controversial, but I think it is also very valid. Sing in English. Most of the bands didn't sing in English, they sang in Russian, and the language barrier is a huge problem, especially in the 1980s. Nowadays, we are more, international, global thinking. We have, Korean pop music. We have a huge music trends coming out of South America onto the pop charts. But back then, music was very divided, and coming in with material in Russian, especially when you're doing music that is not, some novelty song, it's very, very, very hard. I mean, just think about like, okay, how many songs from the 1980s were huge hits that were sung in something that isn't English? Okay, the only thing that comes to my mind is like the 99 Luftballon song. And maybe, you know, like Voyage Voyage, but that's still like a European hit, not even a global hit. Basically, all the bands sang in Russian. Center sang in Russian, Kino sang in Russian. So this is something that, you know, a few artists got, you know, like the Melo bands and Gorebenchikov. But I think if more bands sang in English, they would have done better on the charts and overall, you know, in the Western music sphere. Point number 3, have an original image. Now, I am not talking about original music. I am talking in particular about the visual aspect of the band. It's the 1980s. The era of MTV, everything that was popular back then really revolved around the image. Now, if we look at the Soviet bands, they mostly just look like, you know, ordinary guys. And even though that's actually a good thing in my personal opinion, you know, I love the down-to-earth and normal aspect of Soviet music as compared to the West. If we're trying to make it big there, you should probably, you know, work a bit on the fashion sense. You should definitely work on the way your band, you know, poses in photo shoots and all that awful music industry stuff. But really, it's important. If we look at the bands such as Center or Zvuki Mu, they just look like ordinary guys. And if you saw them on a, you know, in a magazine, you'll just probably like, you know, just look at them for a couple seconds and move on. Nothing really interesting. Doesn't really make you want to listen to the band. That is a huge problem, and I think that if more bands focused on bringing in an interesting visual aspect to their music, the material could have done better abroad. If I had to pick the band that did this best out of the ones we've covered in the series, I would probably pick Avia. Avia were definitely an interesting band to look at, and if you look at their, you know, photo shoots, they had an interesting image and something that would actually make you want to listen to the band, you know, something to get you intrigued. And I know that it sucks that you have to put more into the way you look than the way you sound, but that's just how the rules of the game went for bands that weren't, you know, English or American. If you think about it, all the big bands that sang in their language had to put an effort into their music videos, into their image, and stuff like that. Be it Rammstein or Laibach, or even the modern K-pop bands. You know, they all have to really seriously work on the image. Just the way that it is, you know, if you want to be an ordinary guy with a guitar, you're probably going to stay in your local scene. Only, you know, the American bands like REM have the right to get big off of that. Alright, next up is promotion. You really need to work hard on the promotion of the album. If you want to make it big, you need to make sure that the label puts all their effort into promoting you. You know, you have to basically be showed everywhere. On TV, on the radio, in all the magazines. Sadly, most Soviet bands lacked promotion. The, you know, most important case, I think, where it really broke the band was Kino, but it would also apply to Auktyon or any of the bands that, you know, didn't even have an album release because of, you know, certain bureaucratic mistakes. We need promotion. We need to have bands that get promotion. And I think if I had to pick the artist that probably received the most amount of attention thanks to promo stuff, would probably be Grebenchikov. You need to also take into account all the points prior to this, because just promotion won't do it. You need to have strong material, an interesting image, and then after you get all those things done, you can, you know, put in the money and start placing advertisements for your band across the city. Next step, listen to the experts and avoid conflict. One of the biggest problems is just the character of these artists. They would come to the West and think they know best and start fighting with producers, sound engineers, and everyone around them about how exactly their music should sound and be promoted and things like that. I would assume that if you are a producer living in the West, you probably have a bit more knowledge on how to promote someone else's music here than someone from abroad. And sadly, a lot of the bands were very hostile, I think, to the environment and market. This can be best seen in the Zvuki Mu example, but it applies to a bunch of bands. It could apply to Auktyon. It can also apply to bands that I didn't even cover in this video, like Televizor, for example, who, if I'm not mistaken, when Mikhail Barzykin was asked to be a bit more, you know, lively on stage, he just stood like firmly in one spot, just, you know, to piss off the people who told him to do that. So again, these kind of very, very like anti-audience, you know, scene stuff can hurt the band. Now, I obviously understand it, because you're a young punk band, you want to show that you're authentic. But again, if we're talking about the practical stuff, if you really want to make it big, you're gonna have to kind of listen to the producers, the industry sometimes. Again, I think the band that understood this best was Kino. They avoided all conflict. They basically sacrificed some of their songs, content, just to be put on a French label. If you're going to be always in open conflict, you're going to get dropped very quickly, and that's going to be the end of your story. One last point that is another obvious one. Make sure your band is up to par with the Western standards. Now, what do I mean by this? Does the band play relevant music? Is it music that you can imagine being heard at the time? Is it something that sounds like it was made in 1967 or 87? It's another deal breaker, I think, because a lot of the bands that were doing music in the Soviet Union simply just, were not up to par with the Western standards of what was, popular, or what was demanded by the market. Which, again, it sucks because there's a lot of great bands, but, in the Soviet Union, you could, get away with playing like rockabilly and, power pop in 1989. But if you're talking about the Western market, that stuff was old news and nobody wanted to hear that. So again, something to take into account. I think most of the bands covered in the series didn't have a problem with that. I think most of the music was quite okay and up to par. I mean, yeah, they were a couple years late. I would assume post-punk was kind of fading away by the late 80s. You still had some potential there. You still had music that didn't sound like it was made in the Stone Ages or anything. But there were also a lot of bands that I didn't cover in the video that, I think just didn't make it because the music wasn't very up to par with the trends in the West. Like Machina Времени, for example, great band, but their style of 70s rock just wasn't the thing anymore. Every act we observed lacked something from this list, thus lowering their chances of getting big abroad. Sadly, the Soviet artists weren't ready for the technical nuances of the Western music industry, Soviet bureaucracy, as well as Russian and Western differences in behavior. The main root of the problem can be boiled down to decades of Soviet Union's cultural isolation that resulted in complete misunderstanding of what the people enjoyed abroad and the state's monopoly on mainstream music in the country. Whenever someone did get the chance to promote independent bands, say like Artem Troitsky, they opted to push their close friends and colleagues rather than those who were capable of delivering the right music to the Western masses. Sometimes this resulted in acts like Zvuki Mu getting a chance. Other times you get albums that completely fell apart and were failures like Center. If you were not popular with the rock club critics or lived somewhere beyond Moscow or Leningrad, tough luck. That's my answer and solution after listening to all the failed projects. Sadly, this honest and detailed answer remains to be very boring and technical for the majority of journalists, historians, and online users. So people like to make outlandish claims and turn everything into a poll discussion where the music is left behind in favor of heated political debates that end up going nowhere nor convincing the opposing side. As always, you were on the MelodyBuffet channel, and this was the cursed tale of Soviet rock's trip to the West. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video and drop your comments below. I have a feeling that this time people will have more disagreements, and as far as I understand, that should be good for the channel, maybe, more activity so to say. I also want to give a special thanks to the Telegram channel Между the Rolling Stones и Dostoevskim, also known as Gorby Rock, for helping out with the video. If you want to delve deeper into the topic and find other interesting information about Soviet-Western connections, go check the channel out. It's one of my all-time favorite places to visit online. If only there was someone smart enough at the time who could have known and shown everyone how this is all done. If only there was a person with the right connections, status, and most importantly, taste that could break the Iron Curtain once and for all. Wait a second.